Hello everyone. These series of lectures are on the Constitution of India. These lectures are for the people who have to study polity as a subject and under which they have to understand framework of the Constitution, their different provisions. These lectures would be useful for the students who are preparing for law or are preparing for competitive examinations like UPSC or state PCS. The lecture will be divided on the basis of articles. I will try to take each article one day, and if possible, I will even try to take 2 to 3 articles, depending upon the lectures, whether they are easy or hard to understand. I will also teach you how to read these articles. The language is little difficult. It is a legal jargon. I will give you a brief introduction on the requirement of the Constitution. Why was it needed? Why did our freedom fighters opted for this form of government, which is run under a set of rules and regulation? Now let us quickly see the contents of this lecture. We will look at ancient societies, the primitive societies, the very first societies that were being formed at the dawn of civilization, and how among them a leader was born. Leader, many would think, would have come out as an idea from someone's mind, but rather we will discuss and we would see how the necessity among the people when they are in group brings the need of a leadership among them. We will look at that. Next thing, we have to take a look at ancient Greeks. Greece is a birthplace of very famous, prominent philosophers of those times. These philosophers were the source of these opinions, ideas, philosophy, which would pave the way for the better governance, for different principles which were adopted by various constitution, various lawmakers all around the world. Also, these were the source of various revolutions like French Revolution, American Revolution, Russian Revolution, and even Indian freedom struggle. Next, we will look at a very important document in the history, Magna Carta. We will look what this document is. We will see how elements of these Magna Carta was adopted in American and British Constitution. We'll also see, after getting this brief introduction, we will see the prevailing condition, the prevailing situation of Indian population under British. What were the challenges they faced? The oppressions they faced, the humiliation, and why did they seek these Western ideas? And how were these Western ideas motivating them to fight for the independence? We will also see where and how were these ideas adopted by the freedom fighters and Indian National Congress, INC, and we will later see how Constituent Assembly incorporated these ideas into the very fabric of the Constitution of India. They became the core principles on which the provisions of Constitution stand. And even today, when the judiciary has to interpret the Constitution, it has to take shelter of these basic principles and ideas. Now, looking at hunters and gatherers, it is not entirely known how or why, what was the reason it, that these individuals started to form a group. Let us take a scenario where there is a family consisting of mother and father and children. The basic needs are food, shelter, and they have to also protect themselves from wild threats. In this case, it is very hard for two individuals to take care of all of these responsibilities. And even by any chance, one of them dies or gets sick, this burden comes on just one of the individual, one of the adults. Of course, other families would have suffered the same fate or would have understood that this condition would persist or exist. They would have somehow sought help or support from outside this unit of family. Somehow they would have come come together, helped each other at some sense at some point of time. They would have understood coming of two families together. There would be two pairs, mother and father. Now there are four members. It is very easy in such situations to divide the responsibility. Now for each task there are two people to take care. The hunting, for which only one was responsible, now there are two people. They can work together. It makes them more efficient. Similarly, the other two can take care of the children or children of both the families or take care of the shelter. They can always stay aware and be on a lookout for wild threats. This development would have paved the way for the formation of a very small social unit. Even if there are five or six families living together, you can see that all of a sudden efficiency increases drastically. This would have been the reason for them to come to group. They would have somehow realized over the time. So looking at this, it is not hard to see the growth of this idea of a society where people who don't have blood relations are coming together to help each other, having common problems and common enemies. They would tend to naturally group together. We will see how these groups would demand for a person who can look out, who can take care of the bigger picture. What is the bigger picture here? In a society of, let us say, 20 members, and the responsibilities are divided. Now, just one person doesn't have to take care of everything. Now, let us say five of them are responsible for hunting or food in general. Five of them have to take care of the shelter. Rest five of them have to take care of children and wild threat, have to protect the offspring and the other society members from wild threats. Now, whenever this division happens, you can call it division of labor. What is the labor? Searching for food, or finding shelter, or fighting the threats. This is labor. These are very fundamental labors that they have to perform. Now, as you see, under any given circumstances, whenever there is a group which has different sections who are performing different tasks, there is always going to be a demand for someone to look whether all the sections are doing their work properly. As you can see, because whenever these are human beings, they can have disagreements. All of these five, all of these can have disagreements between them. And because of these disagreements, they have to establish some rules among them. They would not be written, but as a convention or as practice, they may be called a non-verbal agreement among the group. Whenever a fight occurs within such a group, whenever if there is a disagreement, they would need to resolve it, or it puts the whole group or this unit of small society into jeopardy. In every group, there is someone, even today, in every group, even in your friend circle or among your relatives, there is always that one person who is considered stronger than all the others. Let us say that stronger person comes to the front, volunteers to take care of all of the disagreements that are arising, all the fights that are happening among them. This person has volunteered either because he was stronger. There can be one more circumstance that he is most trustworthy. He is most trustworthy among these members. So let us take the case when he is stronger. Now, because he is stronger, he faces less opposition, and it's a natural response. And people generally avoid to disagree with someone who is stronger, either physically or is dominating in his behavior. The stronger person takes the responsibility to look over all of these factions and ensure they are working as per the demands of the whole group. This is the birth of a local king, a local leader, you might say, not a king, but a local leader. And almost the similar scenario happens when someone is chosen because he is trustworthy. People listen to him. So all of them listen to him. He can easily convince each of them. People might have placed their trust in him because he might have been helpful, or he might have been older or more experienced than the others. Choosing any one of the scenario, whether he is strong or trustworthy, this becomes the basis of the concept of a leader. There might be other possibilities, but we will take these two cases. So you can see there was a need for supervision because of disagreements, because of fights, and these are very natural things among human or even in animal kingdom. You can see the animals from the same species fighting each other either for the territory or for food. Therefore, we can conclude that very basic necessities and the fight for these necessities have led to a natural demand for someone to step up and take care of these situations. And thus, we see the birth of a leader. Given the case that he is either the strongest among them or he is trustworthy, what would happen in both the cases? The strongest will gather followers who want to become like him, who envy his position, or just want to follow him. They seek power. In a different case, the society wants to help this person who is trustworthy. They want to provide him with enough manpower so he can enforce the rules which were formed by the consensus among the people. In both of the way, these people are consolidating their powers. This consolidation of power would therefore result in their authority becoming more stronger. There is an old saying that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is in human nature that once you have tasted power or authority, there comes a greed. That is a natural progression. Either of them can become greedy for more power. What they could do, they are greedy for power. And in this scenario, they would always find the way to consolidate their authority further. So by deceiving the people, they can make demands which would secretly make them more powerful. Either it can be done with a force of power, or force of power, or force of strength, or very very primitive diplomacy, very primitive politics. This is the natural progression. You can see the birth of politics in itself, the birth of a leader, the birth of different ideologies. And whenever the leader or the one having an authority starts to go astray, starts to behave in a manner that he is not supposed to behave, or for which he was not appointed or chosen, that is known as corruption. This is the primitive corruption. So, till now, we have seen the scenario. This example was just to make you understand that politics and diplomacy and this relation, this leadership, all these qualities, these ideas are rather inherent. They existed back in that time when there was no society, or rather, there was very primitive society, and still they exist still. In some form or the other, the form has changed, the idea is the same. We still look at our leaders with a hope that they can make our life better. They can resolve the dispute among us as citizens. They can ensure, they can guarantee that we won't die hungry. We would have shelter. We would have opportunities. The needs may be different, but we all seek betterment. The same happened back then. And the same corruption which exists today, given whatever department, whatever kind of administration, whichever form of government, may it be democracy or monarchy or republic, doesn't matter. Corruption happens whenever there is power involved, because greed and selfishness are few traits that are very hard to fight against. Now, over the time, these societies developed, they grew in volume, in number of people, the population grew, the territory they dominated, they ruled over, grew. A small settlement becomes a village, more people start settling there, it becomes a town. If the leader is powerful enough that he may even dominate other such groups, or subdue or defeat such leaders of other groups, he may become even more authoritative, more powerful. This would lead to the formation of a unit. You can call it kingdom. And because the problems are the same, the corruption is the same, people are still looking for betterment. The more resources they gather, more their standard of living progresses, so their aspirations will. Let us talk about ancient Greece. Greece is considered the birthplace of democracy. It was because of the philosophers that were born at that time. Now, philosophy is distinct in a way, it talks more about the world which is non-materialistic. talks about ideas for the betterment of life. They search for happiness, they search for truth, they seek a better life, they seek peace. In ancient Greece, there were so many philosophers, but most prominent of them, those were Socrates, Plato. Plato was the disciple of Socrates. In the same series, there is Aristotle. Now, as we have already established that whatever the form of government, whatever the era, whatever the time, there are always disagreements, there are always problems. Someone is always trying to steal others' property. There is always a fight for resources. Someone is fighting for power, someone is fighting for authority. There is always a danger to the person who is an authority. So there are always problems. The leaders and the kings tend to ignore the problems or suffering of common men when they become greedy or they are selfish. So, to elevate the society from their suffering or to em- emancipate them from their misery, these philosophers thought of ways in which these kings should behave, these leaders should behave, or whether the authority given to these leaders is justifiable or not. We look at the idea of Plato, what Plato suggested back then. Plato advocated a benevolent monarchy ruled by an idealized philosopher king who was above the law. You see, Plato didn't outright reject the idea of a monarch. He supported that there should be monarchy, there should be a ruler, but he should seek peace. He should be peaceful. He should be a philosopher who was above the law. Plato keeps that one person, that one king, that one leader. He is above the law. He is the one who will create the law. Law doesn't apply to him because he frames the law. He makes rules and regulations, and the people will have to follow them. And why did Plato supported this idea that the king should be a philosopher by nature? Because philosophers are the people who study non-materialistic ideas. They look for the betterment of a person or an individual in terms of his behavior, his morals, his values, his ethical grounds. Philosophers seek wisdom. They are reluctant to follow the path of materialistic wants. Therefore, Plato wanted a king to be philosopher, so he would be hard to get corrupted, which you can see in just the next sentence. Plato nevertheless hoped that the best men would be good at respecting established laws, explaining that where the law is subject to some authority and has none of its own, which means if the law is subdued by or is imposed by an authority. So, in this case, in the case of Plato, there is an authority and it gives power to the laws. It is not the other way around. The authority is the one who is making laws. So, laws depend upon the authority, which means the law doesn't hold any power by itself, it depends upon the authority. The collapse of the state, in my view, is not far off, which means he says if this is the case, whenever there is an authority which gives power to the laws, he proposes that it may lead to the collapse of state for sure. It is not far off. But if law is the master of the government and the government is its slave, which means if there is which means if this relation which means if this relation is inverted, the laws are the masters and the authority have to always adhere to the laws or have to always follow the laws. This, he says, brings out the situation which is full of promise. Men enjoy all blessings that the gods shower on the state. So he proposes that whenever laws hold supreme and the authority is a slave in his term, it is a slave, the government is a slave, then the situation is full of promise and men enjoy all the blessings. He talks of a society which is happier, which has hope, which has aspirations, full of promise. It creates an environment of certainty which ensures that if something is wrong, it will be corrected. If you haven't done a crime, you won't get punished. It makes sure that the people are relieved that when they follow the right path, they cannot be questioned. It is full of promise. What is the promise? The promise is of good life, and they enjoy all the blessings. It is his way of saying that in this way the system works well, the society is happy. Now look at the idea of Aristotle. What Aristotle has said. Aristotle doesn't wander off much farther, but has a little difference. Aristotle thinks that the highest officials should not wield power beyond guarding and serving of the laws. He proposes that these higher authorities should only have two responsibilities, which is guarding the nation with strength, with manpower, and serving the laws. Serving the laws means they should follow the laws. They should be the servant of the laws. Whatever the laws state, they should make sure that those are imposed rightly. They cannot decide what the laws are, but the laws decide their actions. He further says that it is more proper that law should govern than any one of the citizens. Upon the same principle, if it is advantageous to place the supreme power in some particular person, they should be appointed to be only guardians and servants of the laws. It is the same thing reiterated in his own words. This was the idea. He said that it should be always laws who should govern. There should not be any one citizen. And following the same principle, if it is advantageous, only if it is profitable for the citizens or for the nation to place a supreme power in some particular person, if there is an inevitable need, then in that condition you can place the supreme power in some particular person. But he also mentions a condition that they should be appointed to be only the guardians and servants of the laws, as we have discussed. Now, the story revolves around 13th century England, 13th century AD, England. The society during this period in England was feudal society. Now, this is a form of government or the form of rule where the king is the owner of all the land. Now, king being the owner of all the land, he used to distribute a parcel of land, a piece of land among barons. Barons were nobles by birth. You have to be hereditarily noble to be a baron. So the king used to distribute the lands among the barons, not in return for revenue, but in return of military service. King demanded barons to give military service in return of these lands which were given to barons. At this time in England, there didn't used to be a standing army. Now, the standing army is a kind of army which is permanent, which means soldiers are always on duty. They have to maintain arms, their horses, and regular trainings happen even when there is no war going on. But in case of England at this time, army was always organized when the king demanded it. There are some instances when even peasants were provided arms and were asked to serve as soldiers. So military service is asked by the king, barons are given the land. Now the land under the barons, which was given by the king, was majorly divided into two parts. One was directly administered by the barons. These barons used to have direct control over these lands. Other part was parceled out or distributed among knights, various knights, who used to administer the rest of the areas. These knights also belong to the nobility, or you can say higher class. They might be the family of barons. These were trained as highly skilled soldiers and were also trained in organizational skills. Now, the land which was directly administered by the barons was further divided. One part used to house these barons. It was called manor. House these barons means it was a castle or a fort or a bungalow where these barons used to live. Also, they used to house or they used to have few personnel, armed personnel, or simply few soldiers for the protection of this fort or this castle, also to help these barons for the administration. Along with that, it used to have a storage for arms and armories. It also used to have a stock, a food stock. So this was manor. Other part was the farming land, the agricultural land. Now the total produce which used to be generated by this land directly goes to the barons. Total produce. This total produce goes directly to the barons. Now this part of the land was further divided into a village, a village and the agricultural land. Now these agricultural lands were rented to the peasants by these parents, for which they had to pay a revenue. The revenue was a part of their produce. These peasants used to farm these lands which they didn't own. The land was owned by kings. Ultimately, the kings used to distribute these lands among the barons. The barons, therefore, used to rent out these lands to the villagers, to the peasants. They used to decide which peasant, which farmer would rent which land and what amount of produce would a particular farmer is obligated to pay to these barons. Villagers used to, or the peasants used to pay a part of produce. So we can say part of the produce goes to the manor, part of the produce. Now there was a condition that was applied on these villagers. They had to free of cost or they didn't used to get paid for this free service. This free service was farming the lands of these barons, the total produce of which would directly go to the barons. Peasants won't get any part of the produce of this land, and along with that, they had to provide free service. They won't get paid for it. So the total produce used to go to the barons from this part, and then they have to come and farm their own lands, a part of which was paid as revenue by these villagers. Similar was the situation of the land under the knights. So let us quickly divide this into, let us say this is the manor. Now here also there is a piece of land, agricultural land, a part of which the total produce of which goes to the knights, and the other part which used to be farmed by the villagers or the peasants. So same as before, the villagers would first farm these lands which directly belong to the knights. The total produce used to go to the knights, and they would come back and then farm their own lands in return for a revenue which is a part of the produce. So you can see there is a total exploitation of the peasantry, of the farmers going on. They had to provide, they were obligated to provide this free service to their lords, in return of which they didn't used to get anything. That is why it is free service. They used to come back, they used to farm their own lands, and they had to take care of them and their family. Now it is almost impossible for them to improve their standard of living. Now let us look at Magna Carta. Carta means charter. In simple terms, Carta is a charter. Charter means a document which is issued by an authority, issued by any authority. It could be either government or owner of a company, owner of a company, or it could be issued by a king. This document provides some privileges, some rights, or permission. Permission is given to either an individual or another company or any group. This document permits them to perform a business or a trade on some article. Article means some item to be sold or to be traded on. The document gives exclusive rights or exclusive permission given to some individual, that only you are permitted to either trade or perform some business. Which are not allowed under the law for someone else or for general public. For an example, if let us say today it can be called a license. A license is a kind of charter or document that exclusively you or a particular company is permitted to trade or to mine a land or to sell, for example, jewelry or liquor. To sell, you have to obtain a permission from the authority. That is a kind of charter. In ancient times, the name for this license was charter, and Carta means that exact charter. Magna means great. So Magna Carta means great charter. Now to understand Magna Carta, we should look at a short story about a king of England around 1203 AD. It is a story of King John. He was the king of England. At this time, King John was involved in a war with France. King John was not considered a great leader or an equipped ruler. He lost during the war with France, he lost many ancestral lands which were conquered by previous kings or his predecessors. He lost these ancestral lands which were won over by previous kings. These lands were in France, and during the war with France, France regained all of those territories. He was also infamous or unpopular because he used to impose irrational and heavy taxes. Also, he had to pay compensation compensation to the parties who waged war against England, and King John lost the wars. So whenever a treaty was signed, these warring parties, the opposite parties, demanded for compensation of the war. What happens is whenever there is war, both sides will have expenses either for arms, for men, food. These expenses are severe, as right now you might have seen or you might have heard in the news that America is waging war on Iran and there is a war going on. So America is incurring losses in billions. So whenever a party wins, let us say one party wins, the party which lost the war has to pay compensation under a treaty. Compensation is the expense that was incurred by the party who won the war. This party will demand funds from the losing party, which is whatever expenses the winning party have incurred. There were many of such reasons because of which King John was getting more and more hated by the nobles and the peasants both. He was inefficient, unsuccessful, ill-equipped leader, and rest of the nobility resented him. So when he was away in France fighting the war, these barons came to know that John has lost lands and had to pay compensation, for which the barons had to pay. Now, this led to few barons rebelling against the crown, against the king. They gathered support from other barons, and therefore it started to become a complete baron rebellion. When King John came back from France, he was faced with this rebellion, and therefore, instead of holding talks, he started a struggle. He started a fight against these barons. So, this is to set a picture that there was a tussle between barons and King John. The kingdom crown and the nobles were having disagreement, and in fact, not disagreement, he was outright resented by these barons. These barons wanted to get rid of this oppression by this king. Now let me rub this. So over the time, over the period of 10 to 11 years, this fight spread. A time came where barons took over London. This happened around 1215 AD. Barons took over London and the king had to submit. A meeting was arranged for them to come to a table and negotiate. Now, this happened because it was the responsibility of barons ultimately to provide the soldiers to the king. King didn't have a standing army, therefore, he was not able to gather soldiers to fight against the barons because ultimately they were the barons who will provide the soldiers. Therefore, you can see barons were at an advantage. King had to submit. A meeting was held. In this meeting, the king had to sign a document, the document containing some demands by the barons. These demands were signed by the king. Now, these demands and this document is called Magna Carta. Now, we will look at what were the major demands. We won't go through all the demands, we won't go through all the clauses. The document was pretty lengthy, but we would only look at those demands which were the source of inspiration for various revolution among the countries like France, America, and even India. The ideas which were born out of these demands are still adapted and still included in so many major constitutions. So we will only focus on those few clauses. Now let us look at three major demands. The first demand was that there should be no arbitrary taxes without common council of the kingdom. No arbitrary taxes means there should be a justification for each and every tax, which is justification means there should be enough valid reason and it should be fair. Valid reason and the reason should be fair. Now, fair means not favoring any party or any side, or we can say unbiased. And apart from this, it should not be without common counsel. Common counsel means without the agreement of the people on whom the taxes are being imposed. So there should be the agreement between both the parties, the king and the subjects who are paying imposed the taxes on. On principle, this meant that each and every citizen under the rule of the king should have a say, which means he should have a voice, he should have a chance to give his opinion whether he accepts the tax or rejects it. But this was just on principle. Practically, as you can see, peasants were already oppressed. They were not allowed to even leave the land without the consent of their lords. It even goes as far as that even for marrying someone, the consent has to be taken from the lord. So at least it was on principle, and we have to only focus on the principles, on the demands, major demands, and how they are reflected over the time. So we won't go much into the details whether these demands were fruitful and up to what effect were they followed. Now this demand gives rise to a very important phrase or a very important clause in American Constitution, which is no taxation without representation. Representation. This was directly taken into the American Constitution. Second demand was that no free man could be imprisoned or stripped of their rights except by the lawful judgment of their peers or the law of the land, which means that no one could be arrested and put into prison, or their rights cannot be snatched, or they cannot be made devoid of their rights until and unless there is a lawful judgment of the peers. Peers means similar countrymen who are similarly situated, or you can say fellow countrymen. Fellow countrymen. plural, which means there should be a group of countrymen who should be included or involved in that judgment, and those should be the people who would judge whether the person should be imprisoned, should be punished, or he should be relieved of all the blames, all the charges. This is directly taken into the American Constitution. You might have seen in movies or web series in America, even in TV shows or in news, that whenever there is a judgment, you would see that apart from the judge, there is a group of people, of commoners, which is known as jury. So it is a group of commoners, and whenever a judgment is passed, it doesn't directly come from the judge. It is voted upon by the jury. And this system is an adoption in the American Constitution directly from this demand, this one clause of Magna Carta. One other demand was that to no one will we sell, to no one will we deny or delay right or justice. To no one will we sell justice simply means the justice could not be bought, could not be bought, which means nobody can bribe a judge to make judgment in their favor. To no one will we deny. It is from the king. We means the authority or the judges. So to no one will we deny. We cannot refuse. If a person has come seeking justice, the court are obliged, the authority is obliged to provide him with the due right, the right which has been given by the law. If you reach a court, the court has to take a trial or has to listen to your plea. Apart from that, it also ensured that there should not be any delay. It is said that the justice delayed is justice denied. It is rather a modern saying, but the idea comes from this particular clause. On principle, there was no time limit set, but it was agreed that justice should be served as soon as possible. As soon as possible. Now, on principle, this is a rather revolutionary clause. So, on principle, these all demands were very revolutionary for the time. Therefore, these ideas spread to different lands, to different neighboring lands, and over the time, these ideas traveled as far as India. And you can see that in India also, even though we don't specify a time limit for the judgments to be passed or a case to be closed, but we still have a common understanding that if the courts are late in delivering justice to a person, to a victim, then it is considered as injustice. So, this event of a king accepting the demands of the people whom he ruled upon brought his unlimited authority and power to be restricted by these demands. Before this event, the king could make rules without any challenge. It is not that kings didn't have to face consequences of their action before. Let us say that even if the king was very successful and had won many wars, and then because of some reason he sentenced all the barons to death, what would happen? Barons would have still rebelled because they also want to live, and they also held power, and most important element, they had soldiers. Kings would have still lost to these barons. So you can see It is not the case that the king was free to do whatever he wanted to. He had to suffer the consequences. But in this case, his authority and his image of being this supreme entity who is above the law is diminished. Before people would have not questioned his authority. They could have fought but not have questioned the king's authority. But after the struggle, they would have understood that king is not all powerful after all. Well, this document is actually terms and conditions that the king should follow, and in case if he doesn't follow these terms and conditions, then there could be a rebellion again. So Magna Carta can be looked upon as terms and conditions in a deal between the government and the people who are governed. These terms and conditions are considered as supreme laws, or today we call it the Constitution. For example, in India, the government have to follow the Constitution, and also the citizens have to follow. They have to comply to their part of this agreement. If government takes any action which is not consistent with the constitution, then they might have to face protest. So like in any constitution, Indian constitution is also an agreement followed by both the parties. This would be the end of first part of this lecture. There are two more very important topics which we need to touch upon before reading any article of the constitution. It is about various ideologies and principle borrowed from the Western world, and the reason as to why our freedom fighters chose to borrow them. Thank you.